On order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee, and delighted to be joined by our panel here for the review into flooding resilience in England. I'm joined by Baroness Brown of Cambridge and Professor Richard Dawson. If I could just invite you to introduce yourselves and your role on the Climate Change Committee, please.
Hello, I'm Baroness Brown. I chair the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee.
Very much.
Hello, I'm Professor Richard Dawson. I'm based at the School of Engineering in Newcastle University, and I am the flooding champion on the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for joining us. If I'd start with you, Baroness Brown, a recent survey highlighted that public confidence in the UK's preparedness for climate impacts, particularly on flooding, is low. 78% of respondents believe that the country is unprepared, and the number believing that that we were moving broadly in a positive direction was below 20%. I mean, given these findings, do you and the Adaptation Committee share this pessimism about the UK's current readiness to address climate risks?
Well, I do recognise that public sentiment, and I think that stems from the problem we have with right across adaptation in the UK, which is that the public has no idea what the government's targets are. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the Environment Agency and their flood and coastal erosion management plan, we welcomed that second flood and coastal erosion management plan when it was published. Was it back in 2020, Richard?
Sounds about right, yes.
Yes, because it was a huge improvement on the last one. And at that time, the capital they asked for, about £1 billion a year, was provided. Of course, we've had quite a lot of inflation since then. So in terms of achieving what it set out to do, it isn't quite achieving the targets that were set out then, but it's quite close to achieving them. But what the challenge is, the public has no idea what those targets are, and even more importantly, even if it did know what they are, the public doesn't know, what does that mean for me in my house? And sure. That's a huge gap.
And clearly, if water's rushing up your drive towards the front of your house, the government's performance against targets, not a lot of interest.
Absolutely,
but turning to one side for a moment where the public are, where are you? Are you optimistic about how prepared we are as a country?
Well, we gave this area in our last progress report back in 2023. We called this area an area of mixed progress, because there has been some positive development in terms of the major infrastructure, that the new major infrastructure that the Environment Agency is funding to put in place, although that programme is now running a bit behind plan, and it's not going to deliver as much as was expected when the funding was allocated because of things like inflation. And of course we have now just had the new modelling of flooding risk from the Environment Agency, which actually shows that a lot more properties have moved into the highest risk category. There's been a 90% increase with this new modelling of the number of properties in the highest risk category, so about a 1 in 30-year chance of flooding from river and coastal flooding. And there's been a 200% increase in the number of properties now thought to be at risk from surface water flooding. Now, surface water flooding isn't usually quite as damaging because the water levels aren't usually as high as river and coastal flooding. But that's improved modelling and understanding has led to a huge increase in the risk of surface water flooding, the kind of thing we might see in central London, particularly the centres of cities where we're gradually paving over everything.
And so you're saying we are now better aware of how dangerous it is, or that actually there is an increase in the number of people who are threatened, or both?
We are now better aware, and of course, because of climate change, because of population growth, because we continue to do some development in flood zones, and because we keep increasing the amount of impermeable surfaces in our developments, risk is increasing.
Yeah. So you'd have been walking through the town centre and were approached by one of these pollsters, and they'd asked you whether you thought Britain was well prepared. What would your answer have been?
I would have said we were not well prepared, and unfortunately people don't know how to be prepared. People need a much better understanding of what can the government do, and what do they need to do for themselves, and how do they help themselves to become resilient to the things that the government can't actually prevent from happening.
Sure. And what impacts do you feel that flooding currently has in England to people who are affected?
Well, in terms of, it has a lot of impacts. There's a lot of damage to property and things, and I'll turn to Richard from that. But I think one thing we don't talk enough about is actually the impacts on people's health. We know that people, there is research that shows that people who are affected by flooding experience mental health impacts, and indeed the longer they are out of their houses, the more severe those mental health impacts are. And indeed for vulnerable communities, we know those impacts are even more extreme. And of course vulnerable communities, the elderly, people on lower incomes, perhaps people who are less likely to have insurance, this can be absolutely devastating. Yeah. So I think we do really need to take more cognizance of the health impacts. But let me ask Richard to fill in on the other impacts.
That is a very significant one. So if we perhaps refer to a very recent example of flooding over New Year's around Greater Manchester. And there I think we see quite a nice example of the challenges that the nation faces in terms of trying to tackle and ensure our resilience. So we saw some surface water flooding, river flooding. We saw breaching of a canal asset, a canal flood defence embankment, and that led to damages to property. Baroness Brown has already talked about the social well-being impacts on the people, and we heard about 1,300 people, I think, were evacuated and moved. Those health issues are especially acute for people who rely on things like healthcare at home, and so that has a knock-on impact to our healthcare sector as well, because those people need support delivered through other ways. But I'd also draw attention not just to damages to property, but also disruption to our core infrastructure services. And that example of the Bridgewater Canal failure led to disruption to rail services. It led to flooding of a sewage treatment plant. And all of those have a much wider knock-on impact across our economy, and people who aren't necessarily directly wet, if you like, will also experience the impact of that flood.
Yeah, and I mean, Baroness Brown, you said about the mental health impacts, and there's several members on the committee who have got constituencies that have been regularly victims of flood. I've been one of those in Chesterfield, and one of the things that strikes me is that when you've been flooded, the fear of being flooded again never leaves you, and actually what we're seeing is the people who were flooded back in October 2023 have since then had I think at least 3 flood warnings, and they've relived the whole thing again. So you're absolutely right about the impact whilst they're out of their property, but when they're back in, the thought that they are a flood victim, they never stop being a flood victim. They're constantly affected. And one of the things that they feel really strongly is that they are, that sometimes there's criticisms that the warnings they receive were too late, but also there's criticisms that as soon as you get a bit of rain, we get a warning, and actually, we can see the river's nowhere near high enough. But it feels like the agencies are protecting themselves by sending these warnings out all the time. And then as a potential flood victim, you're sat there, do we stop everything and move all the furniture upstairs 3, 4, 5 times a year? Or do we take our chances, and knowing that if we take our chances, we might have disastrous consequences? And obviously in one of these communities, In Chesterfield, tragically, we had someone drowned in their own front room in 2023. So in terms of the work that your committee's done, where do you feel that we are on our ability to actually provide predictions and sort of reassurance to those who've been flooded as to whether it's likely to happen again?
I'm not sure we can provide. I'm not sure we're in that good a position in providing reassurance. I mean, there is an assessment made of the quality of flood alerts, and I haven't got the data for the most recent assessment, but typically a very high proportion of flood alerts are assessed as being good quality, so giving people the right information in good time. At times of extremely bad weather, the quality level of flood alerts does decline. That's something we have seen. I don't know, Richard, if you have further data on that. But of course, I mean, we look at it as a committee from a sort of macroscopic level, not from the individual kind of community level, because we are trying to, we're trying to look at England or sometimes national data. So, those are very real experiences that you talk about, and they probably don't come through very strongly in our reporting, I'm afraid.
Understand. Okay, and Professor Dawson, what are the major gaps or weaknesses in Britain's flood resilience efforts?
Okay, so I think we have, as we were talking about earlier, we have a good understanding of the risks, the scale of the challenge. In terms of resilience, I think our response, if you like, is well geared up to deal with and deliver capital investment in big flood defence infrastructure, and a lot of the decision-making processes around do I spend or whatever will favour and look at larger settlements, big investments. Where I think we struggle in terms of getting the right balance is in the smaller schemes for smaller communities, individual houses, delivering resilience measures at a sort of individual property level. And also implementing and integrating, if you like, what are often referred to as sort of natural flood management or wider catchment scale measures. And some of that is stems from, I guess, the kind of the governance that we are often dealing with lots of different landowners and other organisations who have responsibility in those spaces. I think the other area where we need to look at as well, and you've already touched upon this, is actually not so much around the sort of the science of the forecasting, but more the communication of those messages, because something doesn't quite seem to be joining up. We have, I think, I was trying to find the exact numbers, but it is around about half the people who receive a message in a recent survey would say they didn't know what to do, how to respond. And so we do have to, I think, address that. So a few kind of issues there, if you like.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to bring Ellie Chowns, and then did you want to just briefly come in with a point?
If you wouldn't mind, Chair.
Yeah, sorry, I'll bring Cameron in, then we'll come to your section, Ellie.
Thanks, Professor. You mentioned about how some of the mitigation elements need to be done at an individual property level. Some of my constituents are flooded on a regular basis, and they've had trouble getting from the local authority the funding to pay for their own mitigation measures. It's a problem that repeats on a yearly basis. Do you have any thoughts as to how we might make that simpler for them?
Not explicit, but there needs to, this has to be something I think that is looked at least in terms of policy and macro level. We have insurance industry have a key role to play in here. I think Flood Re have set an important tone recently about talking about building back better. But we also need to see more grants being made available to support that process.
All right, thank you.
And I think especially for more vulnerable households who are less likely to be covered by effective insurance. And, we look at dealing with vulnerable households and supporting them to do insulation to make their homes warmer, to enable them to move towards net zero. We also need to be thinking about how do we, if they are in in flood zones, how do we support them with making sure they can put in property level flood resilience measures as well?
Absolutely, thank you.
Before we move on off this topic, we'll just bring Julie Buckley in and then...
Just very quickly then, so we often represent rural areas where we have a small number of houses that are flooded frequently rather than a large number, once every 10 years. So how do you feel about proposing changes that instead of grants being allocated on the basis of scale, so the number of properties, that another factor in there ought to be the frequency, even if it's a lower number of properties?
I feel nervous about jumping straight into a specific recommendation, but I think that is an important criteria. So that we do need to think about this, and one of the ways that we've been thinking about this in the Climate Change Committee is around recommending, and this is endorsing as well, I think, recommendations from the National Infrastructure Commission as well, of having some clear resilience standards, just as they do in the Netherlands. Now, in some cases, those might be dominated by delivering flood defences and the typical kind of hard, big infrastructure. But in smaller, more rural communities, then I think that we do need to see other ways of delivering that protection and that resilience as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, and I can't resist the temptation to just chip in on this line of commentary, I suppose, because two of the things that happen in my constituency, which is frequently subject to flooding, number one, that in order to get grants from the government schemes, people have to demonstrate that they've applied every year for insurance, and if they can't get insurance one year, they've done that for several years, given up applying for it because they're never going to get it, and then find themselves ineligible for grants when a flood does hit because they haven't got the paperwork proving that they were rejected. That's a serious issue. And the other thing is, of course, people no longer being able to sell their properties because mortgage companies won't give mortgages on properties that are increasingly subject to flooding, which does lead me on to the topic of my question, really, which is about the impact of climate change, because what we're seeing is effectively moving goalposts of flood resilience, aren't we? And so I'd like to ask perhaps Baroness Brown first, can you comment on how climate change, including the increasing frequency and severity of heavy rain, storms, is affecting the resilience of our country's the sustainability of our country's flood resilience mechanisms?
Well, in the last climate change risk assessment, CCRA 3 that we did, that does indicate that our projections at that time showed that by the time we get to 2050, even if we're on a path to net zero, there will be more properties at risk of flooding, more people exposed to flooding than we have today. So that says that our programme is not designed to get us into a much better position than we are today, and it's not quite keeping up, in fact, with, again, those changes in the climate, the changes in population growth, the further development of houses in flood zones and things that is going on. So but the issue there seems to me that we need a national debate to say what's affordable and what do people expect. Because in order to, this is a programme that is saying that actually what's cost effective to do is invest about $1 billion a year in additional flood defences. If we want a programme that invests a lot more than that, then that money has to be found, and there needs to be a debate about, is that the best place to put it? It's a really difficult one. I think the problem is there isn't that national debate. We don't have those national standards. We don't have an adaptation strategy for the UK that says, like the Delta Plan says in Holland, this is the resilience standard which the Delta Plan and the committed investment the government has in that, the 27 billion euros, whatever it is, this is the resilience standard that will be delivered to people. And therefore, beyond that, you need to be prepared in the following sorts of ways. And I think that's the debate we need to say to people, is it acceptable that more people will be exposed to flooding by 2050, or do you want a government to be spending a lot more on this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And perhaps Professor Dawson, we've already touched on the the issue perhaps of, on the one hand, needing to protect existing infrastructure from that moving goalpost of increasing problem of flooding. We've also got an issue, which I think you've mentioned, about we're building new infrastructure now. Are we making sure it's sufficiently flood resilient? So would you like to comment on those two issues? And in particular, I understand that the Thames Estuary 2100 project has been for some years now perhaps modelling a good way to think about how we manage long-term these risks. Any comments on that?
So in fact I might I'll have a go with that, and then I might pass over to Baroness Brown, because she chairs one of the advisory boards for the Thames Estuary project, so it might be best to hear directly from her on that. So I think there is a big challenge for new infrastructure and for new housing. At the moment, our most recent data suggests that we're still building about 7% of our new homes in flood zone 3, i.e. places likely to get wet, which seems like a surprising proportion, given we know the risks. And the kind of I welcome the recent changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, which I think does call for at least should consider adaptation and mitigation to future climate within the new framework, which is a good start. But ultimately, I suppose the sort of process that we go through is seeing a lot of infrastructure and a lot of houses still being built in places at risk. And when they are, we're not seeing increased standards applied to those. So were we to be, if that is a decision made for other reasons, other drivers, then we need to make sure that those properties, that infrastructure, is well protected and won't fall apart next time there's a big flood. So we do need, again, I think it comes back to this point about setting very clear standards about what we can expect, what people can expect, and again having that conversation around the trade-offs, what we can afford within that as well. But I do think that this particular issue of new build is especially acute. If we're aspiring to build 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years, then we have to make sure that they are resilient to flooding and other climate change impacts as well.
And perhaps if I come in, the Thames 2100 plan is, I think, a very good approach to planning. It says, what do we think is going to happen in the long-term future? What do we need to monitor now to see whether we're progressing towards that? So what sort of sea level rise, for example, are we likely to be experiencing by the end of the century, and what does current monitoring tell us? So when do we need to make big decisions, like do we need a second Thames barrier? And indeed, in the last review of the Thames 2100 plan, we moved forward by 10 years that decision that we now need to make a decision in 2040 about what to do for the long term. But there are, and it should do things like reserving land so that where we need to build that barrier, the land is available. But there are challenges with it. So first of all, it's not a statutory plan. And secondly, there is a complex network of defences that along the Thames Estuary that protect London. Only 12% of that network is actually owned by the Environment Agency. So 88% of that network depends on the riparian owners, the people who own the land beside the river, doing the right thing and keeping those defences up to standard. And although the Environment Agency has some powers to try and ensure they do, they are not very strong. And then when we get to 2040, which is not a very long way away, there's no mechanism for saying where does the funding come from if what the 2040 decision is that we do need a new Thames barrier. How is that going to be funded? So it's a great example of what we call adapted planning, doing the no regrets things now and keeping our options open for the future and doing the monitoring so that we can keep reassessing which of those future options is the most cost effective and the best way to move forward. And it's held up internationally as a great example of that. but it does have these challenges that it isn't a statutory plan and it isn't a funded plan.
Thank you very much. Alison Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask you both how effective you believe the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy is, and what changes, if any, need to be made to strengthen it when it's reviewed in 2026?
I think Richard is probably best placed to give you a good answer on that one.
So when it came out a few years ago, I thought it was a big step forward, and so I want to start with sounding a positive around a lot of good thinking that's gone into that. And in fact, one of the things I remember welcoming at the time was a view to take a much more integrated approach, looking at all sources of flooding, coastal, fluvial, and surface water. I think where it has struggled perhaps to achieve some of that is really predominantly around some of the issues that Baroness Brown touched upon in terms of actually delivery. We've talked about a good start to the budget and capital investment, but inflationary pressures and some other drivers reduced that, and so it's actually delivering far less in terms of what it hoped to achieve in that sort of 5-6 year cycle. That in terms of surface water management, what we see though is still a very complicated picture of who owns assets, who's responsible, and how to deliver if you like, robust surface water management in what are quite complicated spaces like cities, where and even in as we were hearing along the Thames estuary and so on, where there's multiplicity of ownership, and of course drivers of cost put pressures on that. So I think that would be one of the starting points. And the other perhaps key issue is coming back to again, I think where we started. With around those wider issues of resilience. We've been good at delivering big capital projects for the most part, but less successful at rolling out wider resilience measures to individual homes, smaller communities, and implementing sort of real change in the way we manage our land and sort of slow down water flows in catchments. So a few things there.
I think if I could just add, I think the other area where it's fallen down because of the funding was that the capital ask was pretty much granted, but actually the requirements for maintenance were not properly taken on board. So, the Environment Agency used to have a target of 98% of its assets were in a good standard. With all of the bad weather we've been having, they've been finding assets have been deteriorating faster than historically. So I think 2 years ago they had 94% of their assets in good condition. They have now, I understand, reduced their target to having 94% of assets in good condition, but the latest numbers, I think that only 92% of their assets are in good condition. So this issue, it's not just the capital, it's actually maintenance of this growing base of assets as well that's really important. And then that issue that Richard flagged before, that of course the plan is done on the basis of value for money. So it's very easy to do a value for money calculation where you've got a large town, or you've got a sewage works and some very important major roads. You easily get the value for money. Where you've got smaller communities and things, that's when that sort of analysis doesn't necessarily doesn't deliver you particularly good outcomes for people.
Thank you very much, both of you, for that. Baroness Brown, how would you assess the coordination between national and local flood risk management bodies and the government in implementing flood resilience measures?
I think it can be very complicated because there are so many different parties involved, and particularly when you come to things like surface water flooding, where when you have particular issues around drainage where you may have the water companies may also be involved. So I don't think we always get that coordination right. And we certainly don't always get the well, it's clear that we don't all get the communication, particularly with homeowners and members of the public right. So I think there is more to do there, but it's actually quite variable. Some places, I think, do it very well, and other places have less good outcomes. So, I think it's one of those things that, with all the pressures on local authorities, there are probably some who are better positioned than others.
Thank you very much. And just following on from that, Baroness Brown, is the current governance structure sufficient for managing flood resilience in the context of climate change, or is there a need for stronger oversight and better coordination?
I think stronger oversight and better coordination would be really helpful, and better funding at all levels of our government, at sort of local government as well as the national government level. But I think, Richard, you've got some thoughts on governance as well. You were talking about.
Yes, absolutely, and I think there's one of the questions and challenges around oversight that we always face when we're trying to sort of scrutinise these things on the committee as well, is actually a sort of mixed bag of data and information on what progress is being made, how many property flood resilience measures have been delivered, what coverage of insurance do we see across floodplains. And I think some of that reflects that sort of I suppose, blend of governance, if you like, and the need for stronger oversight and coordination is we're not pulling those things together, and there's not that kind of clear ownership. And in terms of, I suppose, coming back to the recent floods in Greater Manchester, what happened there was the breach of the Bridgewater canals, actually owned by a private operator. And I think it just highlights again that Baroness Brown made this point in the Thames Estuary, that although we have DEFRA providing sort of overall policy, EA as national strategy leaders, and a lot of delivery on the ground through their local operations, there are still a huge amount of actors out there. And they are obviously even harder to have sort of oversight and kind of responsibility over.
And we have quite a lot of rather important plans to do with flooding. For example, we have the shoreline management plans all around the coast of England, which look at how the shoreline should be managed in the face of increasing coastal flood risk. But again, like the Thames 2100 plan, those are not statutory plans. And so when we did a review a few years ago, looking at how many of the local plans actually even reflected their shoreline management plan, and looking at whether shoreline management plans that people thought they had would pass the value for money test, we found that effectively many of them wouldn't pass the value for money test, and some local plans didn't even incorporate their shoreline management plans. So while we have all these useful plans, they do need, we think, to be put on a statutory footing, both the Thames 2100 and the shoreline management plan. Now, Environment Agency have updated the been updating shoreline management plans, and they have been significantly improved, but they still don't have a statutory basis.
Thank you very much. And just one final question from me. What role, either of you can answer it, what role do you see for the government's flood resilience task force? And if you had to decide what the top 3 priorities were, what would they be?
Well, one of my top priorities would be communication, making sure people know what to expect, what to expect in different scenarios. You know, what kind of protection they can expect in different scenarios, and what kind of resilience they can put in place for themselves. And I'm going to ask Richard to if he wants to pick up on that too.
Yeah, I think for me a key emphasis needs to be moving from just thinking about flood defence infrastructure, but thinking about that wider issues around resilience. How well prepared are we? What, as Baroness Brown said, what can we expect? how do we respond, what's our sort of approach to recovery. So taking a much broader view, and that will start to bring in and tease out, I would expect, a number of these kind of governance challenges and oversight issues that we've talked about.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll take a quick question from Julia Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. I was really interested to hear you talk about that complex arrangement, all that array of different partners, because that is exactly how residents feel, that it's highly complicated. They don't know who does what and they don't know who to turn to. And then you also talk about the need for more investment and better value for money. Do you see any ideas around if there were fewer actors involved, you know, if they were combined in some way, that responsibility was held more in one place rather than fragmented, that in itself could be better value for money? It could lead to perhaps economies of scale, or the shift that Professor Dawson is talking about to not just looking at defences but looking at the longer term solutions, because you can afford prevention from the same budget.
I think you make a very interesting point, and I think at a local level for people to know a single point of contact is always hugely important, who to ask. About your bigger question, it's a very interesting question, and I don't have an immediate answer. I don't know if Richard.
No, I think that's maybe the sort of question for the task force that we were just talking about. But I would emphasise the importance of local agency and actors in that. What we do see regularly in any flood event, that local knowledge, people having community members that they can trust and interact with is so key. There are, I'm sure, lots of ways you can create organisations that look like that and can cope with that. But there is a risk if we overly sort of centralise things that maybe we lose that kind of local connectivity, local touch, and when we're dealing with these sorts of extreme incidents.
Thank you.
Very much. Pippa Halings.
Yes, thank you. So it's really sobering to hear, your analysis. So climate change undeniably increasing the intensity and the frequency of risks of flooding. We've heard about the damage to businesses and to households. In my constituency in South Cambridgeshire, it's also hitting farming. So, last year, a farmer in Huntingdon Farm in Sawston said that it was horrendous and that it was the wettest in his 50 years. And he's along the River Cam, and he was saying, sheep farm, they had to take the sheep off all of the land because they were on islands, flooded islands around. And it was also then the other farmers, because this was then, he said it was all year round, because it then delayed them being able to do the drilling for the seeds, the fertilising and everything. So the impact on farming was huge, was great as well. So if we then come to the question, Baroness Brown, you were talking about in terms of funding, and this is where so the rubber hits the road, Now, in the short term, let's just look at the short term before looking at those longer term overviews. So the government in autumn 2024 last year said that it was looking at providing 2.4 billion for 2024 to 25 and 25 to 26 for flood defences. But has added that significant funding pressures on this budget may mean that it has to review those amounts. So my question is twofold. Do you think, on the one hand, that this level of funding is sufficient to address the increasing climate risks and, as you said, inflation costs? And secondly, do you think that the existing funding mechanisms are adequate to get the right level of funding to where it's needed at the right time?
Well, I think we're probably not the very best people to ask those questions of. I mean, it's, the analysis that goes into what is required for capital funding is based on where is it value for money in terms of the protection it will deliver to put new capital assets in place. Mm-hmm. So we would assume that analysis has been done correctly. And as I say, historically, it's been coming out at about $1 billion a year for capital funding. I've seen some forward projections which suggest similar levels to that. So 1.2 billion a year for 2 years sounds to be in the ballpark you would expect. But I think the key thing is, the basis on which those numbers are derived is that there's a calculation of where is it value for money in terms of the protection it will deliver for us to make those investments. If you want a different level of protection, then you have a different calculation. And that's where we don't have, that's where we have never had in this country any in terms of our national adaptation plan, any strategy from the government that says this is the level of protection we are going to provide. This is the resilience standard to which we will work.
So now I'm hearing what you were saying about, for example, the Dutch example in the Netherlands, where they have resilient standards. So what I'm hearing is by having that sort of plan and saying by standards, do I understand therefore you mean this is what kind of protection we think is necessary across different areas and the standards at which it should be, and therefore we can calculate the costs for that, and that therefore the amount that's being set aside by the government at the moment is just for one type of protection, but it's insufficient if we're really looking at resilient standards.
Well, it's insufficient if we want a different level of protection. That's the challenge.
At the moment, we don't actually know.
Well, I think people in this country do not know what we have from the Environment Agency that this will. I think they had a target of initially in the last settlement of increasing the number of houses protected against severe flooding by 360,000. That by now has dropped, I think, to 200,000.
Yes, 336 down to 200,000.
336 down to 200,000. So that's the additional houses protected by the capital allocations they had been given in the last settlement. I'm afraid I don't know what for these 2 years at 2.4 billion or whatever. I don't know what the target for
you're making us ask an even bigger question, almost existential, which is, we don't know how much we should be spending because we haven't set the had the national debate and set the targets for the country.
Set the vision for what we think a well-adapted UK looks like, and said, okay, that if we want to be well-adapted, what's the implication of that? What should people be able to expect?
Within what is being given at the moment, with the Environment Agency within that funding saying that it's less able now to invest in the same number of projects as it was, do you think that there's also more could be done to adequately resource the Environment Agency for its role and its tasks?
I'm sure more could be done to resource the Environment Agency for its role. Absolutely. It's a really crucial role. Yes. But I think you have Paul Sayers coming in the next session as a witness. And Paul is one of the experts in this country who does these sorts of calculations about levels of protection and things. So I think he would be a very good person to take your questions to.
We did talk about vulnerability, and you were mentioning kind of the level of households. In what way do you think that we're able to provide those most vulnerable with some of the protections that's needed?
I think that's why Richard was saying that actually that local authorities are of enormous importance in this, because of course they know, they can map their communities, they know where they have clusters of vulnerable households, they know where they have care homes and other, where they have clusters of elderly people, so they know where when there is a serious event like a flood that you need to be focusing most help. But also when they have the funding to do it, where you should be focusing the funding to help people to improve their homes, to make them more resilient, or where you should be focusing your communications with people to make sure these people have actually got the message, are actually signed up to the flood warnings, know what they mean and what they should do, have had information about keeping that bag upstairs with your key tablets in. If I remember my elderly mother and the range of tablets she had to take, making sure they've got that bag upstairs that's got those in, so that if they have to move out, suddenly they don't have to be collecting them from different places.
Right, isn't it?
All of that kind of focusing that help.
So that's social capital that's there, that's absolutely critical. And I think it's very interesting that following COVID, police forces around the country then created building on those neighbourhood groups that were helping each other. Then they're calling them community resilience groups. but they're not talking about the kind of resilience we're talking about at the moment. But it could actually be something that we need to
absolutely could
broaden out so that we're actually reaching out. But most of these are voluntary, aren't they?
Flood forums.
The flood forums. And so do we think that we should be actually funding in some way the coordination of those forums, at least?
I think we certainly want to be supporting and helping those forums be strong, broaden their reach. I think that some of their strength comes from the fact that these are kind of bottom-up community groups, and there's always a risk when you sort of parachute in from above of disrupting that dynamic. But Baroness Brown highlighted a number of the really important vulnerability factors around individuals in houses, but we've just touched upon, I think, one that I was going to add in as well, that importance of the kind of social network, the ability to sort of support each other. And we see time and time again where there are community groups, family groups, and people have that kind of social resilience as well as financial and other resilience in there, that the impacts are far less severe, especially in the long term. When you don't have that, then we see much greater long-term sort of social and mental health impacts arising from floods as well.
And is it just on that, the example then also from the Netherlands, is there anything else that you think we should be looking at? We will have a visit, so it's interesting to know. Is there anything else that you, in your opinion, we should be looking at, as well as the resilience standards and the plan that's in place? Any other things that would be, you think, useful for us in terms of taking on board as good?
I mean, one of the things that they do also have in the Netherlands is a clear funding strategy to deliver a long-term plan. So this isn't a sort of you know, 1 or 2 years ahead. They have a much clearer and comprehensive approach to sort of supporting that investment as well.
They also have a lot of very good work on what do flood resilient towns and cities look like, and how you use blue and green infrastructure, both to make it a nice environment for people to live in, but to make it an environment where water has somewhere to go. So they do a lot of work on planning and you know, how do we make our towns and cities more flood resilient, with less, you know, with more porous surfaces and more places for the water to go, because they need to do that. And I think we could learn a lot from that in our planning.
And if I might just follow up on that, I mean, it's not that all of those are kind of unique to the Netherlands even. There are lots of nice examples peppered around the country of what are typically, though, small-scale exemplars of these sorts of interventions and changes in our urban spaces. And perhaps where we can learn a lot from the Netherlands is how you scale up from small peppercorn sort of pockets of excellence and small-scale actions into something that's much more sort of system scale, really thinking about how these little things contribute towards the bigger picture of flood resilience.
And because I'm hearing we're also looking at the house building targets, obviously, so this is something that we absolutely need to ensure that's been taken on board as we increasing climate risks, but as you're saying, so with increasing house building and what impacts will that have on our ability to have those green or blue spaces, or ability to manage water at the same time. And when you said you thought it was very good in terms of the MPPF, would you think that we also need to have a look at incremental impacts on flood zones? So at the moment, every planning application is for itself, but not an incremental impact on that, the amount that we're paving over or making hard surfaces for.
Absolutely, yes. And I think, I don't know if I used the word term excellence to describe it, but I think it's a step in the right direction. We have to be considering adaptation and to the impacts of climate change in every decision we make. Otherwise, we're potentially sort of racking up further, if you like, risk to the country, which we'll have to pay for in some way. So looking at that incremental change, as well as as well as the sort of the trends. So individual actions is good, but those longer term trends, absolutely. And those interactions between multiple new plans and development sites and so on can have a disproportionate compounding effect on each other.
Which then would it cost? The reason I'm asking, Chair, just because it brings us back to the funding, we're then paying the cost, for not having sort of upfront, planned in that way. Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you earlier for stating out loud the impacts on mental health of people that are regularly affected by flooding. I have a resident who spent 9 months of 2024 living from a caravan on his own driveway following flooding in January of that year. As well as the clear influence of climate change, residents in Tewkesbury are concerned that development of floodplains in the constituency has altered the direction and the intensity of fluvial floodwater from the Severn and Avon. As it accumulates, the floodwater regularly enters homes not only laterally but vertically up through the ground. They are further concerned that the development and flood mitigation measures to our north may have increased the intensity of flooding as experienced in Tewkesbury. So to each of you, please, what policies are in place to address situations where land may need to be acquired for floodplains, natural or engineered flood defences?
I shall ask Richard to pick that one up.
That I think it's currently the approach is, as far as I understand it, quite ad hoc and unstrategic. That we often identify where these challenges might be emerging. But as I think we've repeatedly said, you're probably bored of hearing it now, that these plans are often not statutory. And so actually finding the funding to do that is very challenging. So we absolutely do need to address these issues in terms of linking up our approach to land use and our approach to flood management, because the two are, as you've nicely kind of demonstrated there with those examples, very, very closely intertwined.
Thank you. Baroness.
I don't have anything to add to that.
All right, thank you. I do note and respect that you're an engineer, which is why I wanted to add both natural and engineered flood defences. So specifically to the Professor, what metrics are applied to measure the success of flood resilience efforts? How can they be applied to measure the impact of those measures on areas or constituencies as a result of measures implemented closer to the source?
Well, typically we're quite good at looking at how individual actions might reduce the sort of the volume of floodwater and therefore the damages associated with that. So a reduction in, if you like, expected annual damages from flooding, and that's a typical measure used to assess those sorts of actions. Where I think there's a much bigger gap is around understanding, if you like, actions that prepare our communities either for an event itself or for addressing, responding, recovering after those events. And I think we're pretty lacking in, if you like, clear indicators there. We've, I think, mentioned that we've struggled to understand in our own assessments how active the country's been in terms of delivering property flood resilience measures, what level of insurance coverage floodplain inhabitants are able to access, and so on. So there's definitely some important, I think, information gaps that could be acquired or should be within our grasp already, and we're not being able to kind of complete some of those pictures in our own assessments.
Would you accept that one of those gaps is, as is experienced in Tewkesbury, that my constituency is further down the flow of the Severn and may in fact be impacted by flood mitigation to the north?
I would like to just be clear in answering this. I can't comment on Tewkesbury without specific analysis, but the general principle that we perhaps sometimes an oversight of some of the assessments is that we can have a compounding impact elsewhere is one where I think we need to look a little closer. But it's not always ignored, that's for sure. I can give examples of where people have looked at that too.
There's plenty for us to take forward there, thank you.
It's a potential challenge with the shoreline management plans as well, and that, as you say, building up flood defences for one part of the coast has an impact on the adjacent regions, and that's not always historically been very well reflected from one shoreline management plan to the next. So it is a challenge we see across the piece.
Thanks for stating that. Finally, to Baroness Brown, you spoke with my colleague Pippa Halings about local flood forums. I've just lost, there we go. What other examples might you cite of good practice in involving communities and property owners in flood resilience planning? How can community participation in flood resilience measures be made more effective?
Well, we're seeing increasing numbers of cities and indeed combined authorities and other groups having their own climate commissions, and looking, not only at how do we become net zero, but looking more broadly at how do we also adapt to the changes we now know are definitely going to happen, and indeed they could be worse if the mitigation doesn't move faster. And I think there we are seeing most of these areas. We had here in Parliament yesterday, we had the Leeds and South Yorkshire group talking about what they'd been doing, and that comes from various levels of bringing local government together in an area, but also coming out and engaging with people. And I know when I chaired the Climate Commission for the Peterborough and Cambridgeshire Combined Authority, we had some public events where we got the public to come in and tell us what they were concerned about and explain to them sort of the things that might be done. So I do think there's real value in those local events. But I also do know the pressures on funding at a local level mean that it's quite hard to do those at a level of real intensity.
Thanks very much.
Would you mind if I just added to that?
Please do.
I just wanted to draw upon some examples. So Baroness Brown mentioned the Environment Agency led a review of the shoreline management plans, which is the sort of process on the coasts. And I was involved in that review, and what we saw in some of the best practice was that, because I think when we often talk about these community groups, that it's just if you like we often forget that we need to involve a lot of the key agencies, actors and sort of landowners and other kind of key organisations in some of those discussions. And the very best examples of the development of shoreline management plans brought in not necessarily to everything, but as part of those processes, not just members of the community, but key organisations who maybe had a role in the community. Maybe it was the Highways Agency, Network Rail, utility operators, and so on, who had a key stake in, if you like, the resilience of those areas. And I think that's a really important part. We often don't see those organisations so engaged at those community levels, and I think there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask with some rapid fire recommendations that we could make, and just trying to summarise some of the things that I've heard you say. First, would you like this committee to be making a recommendation on the way in which we are informing and educating people about standards?
Absolutely. Yes. Or engaging people in the discussion of what those standards should be, because they are the taxpayers who are going to have to pay for them.
Absolutely.
So it has
Super.
to be
I just want to get it on the record so we've got it there when we come to make our report. And should the Thames Estuary Plan be a statutory one? Is that another recommendation you'd like to see?
I'd love to see that recommendation. It was a recommendation I made having chaired the advisory group for the last review, and we didn't get a response from government on that.
And what about thinking ahead to land banking now for the 21-20 barrier that we're going to have to take a decision on in 2040?
Well, I think that would be the point of making the Thames 2100 a statutory plan, which would enable a lot of the things that will be needed to make sure that we can both do the things we need to do now, but also that the right things are in place for the future.
Super. I want to refer to the residential and business split, because you spoke about where is the balance for money, the cost-benefit balance for money. And at the moment, we're not in looking at some of the flood mitigation schemes, we're not taking into account the business costs, the commercial properties, in the same way as we are residential. And of course, it's also skewed by the fact that we can have private sector funding coming in some areas. Some areas have healthier balance sheets and can contribute. So that is skewing us getting to a standard, is it not? And how do we cope with that?
I don't know, Richard, if you can comment on that.
Well, I think some of the direct damages to commercial spaces are usually considered in national risk assessments, but those wider scale disruptions and sort of secondary losses to the economy, which can be huge, are typically not, because they're a lot harder to measure in advance. In terms of partnership funding, that one of the reasons why the kind of Environment Agency's most recent capital plan has sort of fallen behind, it's not just the inflationary pressures, but actually a lot less was able to be extracted.
That's picked up now, though, hasn't it?
I think so.
The latest figures are about 200 million or more coming in.
Yes, but that's I suppose still it's adding, but it's not enough. And as you say, there's huge inequality in terms of what people can actually, depending on where they are, if you like, about what they're able to get to make up that investment.
Sorry, let me drill down, because we're pressed for time, and I want to push this as much as I can. When you're looking at the values, if you've got a flat in London, close to the Thames, where some idiot has burrowed down into what was a basement which was meant for flooding and created a kitchen and a bedroom down there, and the value of that property is in the millions, that gets precedence, doesn't it, over somebody in a house in Tewkesbury, because by doing the flood alleviation scheme there, you're creating more value than you would be in Tewkesbury.
That's not quite right. So,
good. Tell me why.
In the National Risk Assessment, the assumptions are made about the sort of property values and property damage levels, and those are applied uniformly. So you have a kind of an average property damage curve, and that's how we calculate our expected annual damages. Why larger urban spaces get much higher investment is because there's more properties, more people, and often so that they, I suppose, the cost to benefit ratio stacks up like that.
Thank you. And finally, we know that 59% of Grade 1 agriculture land is at risk, at high risk from flooding. And so I wanted to ask you, Dame Julia, just when you're putting your full hat on as chair of the Adaptation Committee, and we're thinking of adaptation both in terms of food security, we need to have some wider metrics here about biodiversity, about food security, and to be playing these into the metrics that we use. So what metrics should we use to monitor our resilience, not just when we're considering, houses and flooding or communities and flooding, but when we're looking at these other adaptation risks that we need to guard against?
Well, you hit upon an area that is one that we also have said in every report to government that we need much better metrics, so that we not only need proper targets, but we need much better metrics so that we can measure progress. We end up using a large number of proxies, essentially almost any data sets that we can find. So we would look at the amount of agricultural land susceptible to flooding. We'd also like to look at things like soil health, indicate how resilient the soil might be to some of these things. But these are actually some of the metrics we find it very hard to get hold of. So we don't have good selections of metrics in these areas.
So if we were making a recommendation from this committee, it would be about setting out metrics with clarity. Could you perhaps write to the committee to suggest what some of those metrics might best be?
We can certainly give you, to let you know what current proxies we have and how we think that our diagrams which show you how we are trying to measure progress would work in these areas, yes, certainly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you, Barry, and thank you very much, Baroness Brown and Professor Dawson, for that excellent evidence. We will now bring this first panel to a close. Order. One. Order. So we come now to the second panel. I'm joined by Professor Hall, Professor McDonagh, Professor Naylor and Dr. Sayers. Very much thanks to all of you for joining us, particularly Dr. Sayers, who joins us from holiday in Austria, where we hope the weather is kind, and we're very grateful to him for sparing us his time today. Starting with you, if I may, Professor Hall, can I invite you to introduce yourself, your organisation and your knowledge and interest in this area, please?
Thank you. I'm Professor of Climate and Environmental Risks at the University of Oxford. I'm an engineer. I'm a Commissioner of the National Infrastructure Commission, and I'm President of the Institution of Civil Engineers.
Excellent, thank you.
Hello, I'm Professor Briony McDonagh. I'm Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Hull, and I'm the UK National Lead for the Resilient Coastal Communities and Seas programme, and my own research interests lie primarily in people and climate adaptation and resilience.
Thank you. Professor Naylor?
I'm Professor Larissa Naylor, Professor of Environmental Geography and Geomorphology at the University of Glasgow. I have been working on coastal processes and adaptation since 1997, starting with a fellowship at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, looking at the coastal simulator. And I bring a wealth of experience from industry, academia, and Environment Agency.
Excellent. Dr. Sayers? Sorry, just pause there for a second. We can't actually hear you, Dr. Sayers. Can we make sure he's unmuted?
Looks like he's muted.
Yeah.
That's better.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Excellent. Got you now.
So I'm Dr. Paul Sayers. I'm a chartered civil engineer and hold a PhD in system approaches to flood management. I lead an applied research consultancy, Sayers and Partners, and we work extensively on flood and coastal risk issues both in the UK but also importantly internationally in Europe and further afield. And I was the lead author of the flood research elements of CCRA2 and CCRA3. And I collaborate closely with organisations like the ODI and various universities on issues of climate and resilience.
Excellent. Well, thank you, all of you. It's quite a large panel for us, but obviously a very, very knowledgeable panel indeed. I would just say to the panellists that some of the questions will be directed to one of you specifically, some of them to the panel more generally. Please don't feel the need to simply reiterate what you've heard. If the first person has made a comprehensive answer, then that's great. If other panellists have got things they want to add, then obviously we want to hear them. But really, we want to hear sort of important additions or contradictions rather than sort of all four of you feeling the need to respond on all of that. But I'll start with you, if I may, Professor Hall. From your perspective, to what extent do you believe that England's system of flood resilience currently is fit for purpose?
Thank you. There are some parts of this system which I think are working quite well, and there are parts which are in need of further attention, let's say. I think the process of analysing flood risks, of mapping risks, of identifying areas at risk is good, and it has just got quite a lot better thanks to the Environment Agency's latest National Flood Risk Assessment. And that feeds into a process of prioritisation, the principles of which I think are very good as well. The UK has pretty good flood forecasting and warning systems. It's not perfect. It never will be perfect, but the Flood Forecasting Centre, jointly between the EA and the Met Office, works well, and people say that they respond to flood warnings. Areas in need of attention. First of all, the National Infrastructure Commission has recommended repeatedly now, and we heard this from the previous part of your session, about the need for long-term targets with respect to what should be achieved in terms of managing flood risk. Secondly, there's an issue with how much this is costing. The National Audit Office reported on this, and you also just heard that there were to be 336,000 properties protected in the latest Environment Agency flooding settlement, and that has been revised down to 200,000 because of increasing costs. And thirdly, I would emphasise surface water flooding. as being an area where there's a insufficient coordination. It's a very complex problem. No one's saying it's easy, but I think there needs to be more attention to surface water flooding.
Thank you. Dr. Sayers, you want to add on that sort of general question about the extent to which the system is fit for purpose?
Yes, please. Fully support all the things that Jim just mentioned there, but to add a couple of things perhaps where there's room for change or improvement. So we do lots of our work through the expected annual damage, which Jim mentioned there, which is very good for understanding investment case. That's a really good means of understanding the investment case, that kind of average risk. But it is less good at helping us understand the risk we face in terms of the risk profile. So, for example, just to give you an illustration, expected annual damage would think of a low impact, high frequency event in the same way it would think about high impact, low frequency events. So we can unpack that expected annual version to help us understand the nature of the risk more, which helps us manage it more. We're also poor along slightly technical lines, but the issues of spatial coherence in the events. We don't really understand how we manage events that are very widespread in terms of investment and our resilience. And we don't really understand when there's sequences of events, when there's that conveyor belt of events, how that plays out into our investment case and our risk profile.
Okay.
So that, and the other second point I would make is around social vulnerability. When we think about our investments, we quite often currently focus on the index of multiple deprivation. There's a weighting within the process that helps us invest in places that have greater index of multiple deprivation, but that's not flood specific. It doesn't cover the real social vulnerability issues that drive vulnerability to flooding. So there's an issue there around how we target our investment more specifically towards the most socially vulnerable from a more flood nuanced index.
Thank you. Professor Naylor, can you give us an overall sense of what is realistically possible in terms of reducing flooding and how big the gap is between what we currently have and what we might reasonably be able to expect?
Yes. I think following on from the previous question, I think if I can kind of respond to that and then lead in,
sure.
and you maybe ask the question again. I think one of the things, there's several strengths of the strategy as the others articulated, but there's also several areas where it can be improved. And one of them relates to your question about what we can possibly expect. So I think one of the things that the new data sets allow it's something we could not possibly imagine in the past. So these new data sets and the climate emergency, we have this gift, we have this amazing opportunity to see in the future, like previous generations have never had. So the Victorians and the Edwardians who built a lot of the flood risk infrastructure we're using today, still, they couldn't see into the future. The engineers post-1953 floods who used a militaristic model because of the war, they couldn't see into the future. We can, with ever-increasing certainty. So can we use those data to actually get the damage costs, to know exactly what Paul Sayers was just talking about, so we know what the future cost is going to be. So a lot of my work is at the coast. We have a lot of hold the lines at SMPs. There's a caveat that says, can we, if it's affordable? How many of them are going to be affordable? How many more estuary defences, barriers do we need, like the Thames? Where are we going to put them? How do we make that socially just? So that, to me, is a really big area. And we're not looking at resilience limits. So when it comes to the extent of flooding, so the strategy talks about adaptation, but it's in the future. And majority of the focus is on resilience now, in situ, in keeping people in their places. Those places the Victorians and Edwardians designed for us without that future knowledge, without being able to use our predictions. And so I think we need to really focus on how do we strengthen What are resilience limits? The latest IPCC talks about physical adaptation limits, social economic adaptation limits. That's not in the framing. Can we bring that into the framing? And the other thing in relation to that is about adaptation preparedness. We need to shift from being reactive to proactive. We have to adapt. We have to accept that there's those physical limits in these many places in our communities that our forebears created for us. To adapt, Parliament and this government needs to rapidly transform our governance systems and act now to safeguard this space on land. For we know what's coming. It's not if, but when the next storm happens, just as the one is coming on Thursday and Friday. And so I kind of want to challenge, in some ways, to say, what would you like the parliamentary legacy of this to be? Can Parliament work with these risk management agencies and the public to create those legal and financial frameworks that we need so that we can take bold transformative actions together across all of society to have this just adaptation? And that adaptation piece is what really needs strengthening in the strategy. And there's the strength in the new NFP National Planning Framework, number 186 in particular, and the other ones before it, they're really strong to help with this. But we have to live with the reality that there are places that the flooding will be too great, that we cannot have enough property level protection or enough protection of our assets and infrastructure to sustain them in situ.
Yeah. And Professor McDonagh, from your perspective, is there anything you want to add on the question of both the extent to which our flood resilience is fit for purpose and what the gap is between what is, if you like, reasonably possible and where we are now?
I agree with my colleagues. I think policy and plans around river and coastal flooding are generally credible. Coastal erosion risk needs much more attention. It needs statutory teeth and more funding, with a particular focus on resilience and adaptation. And a focus, as Larissa says, on what isn't sustainable. We are not going to be able to hold the line in some places. In particular parts of the country, the upcoming data is likely to show that risks are higher than we had previously anticipated. And we do need to think now how we plan for a better future, how we can be more resilient, what those communities look like, what support they are going to need. And the biggest uncertainty in all of what we're facing now isn't the climate, it isn't even the weather, it's how people will respond and what support we can put in place now to allow our communities to be resilient now and into the future, and how we can do that in the fairest, most just way possible. So as Paul says, we're not amplifying existing vulnerabilities, that actually we're improving things for people within these places.
And so in technical terms, that means not expecting we can prevent people being flooded, but expecting that we kind of learn how to live in an era where people are flooded. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying we need to learn how to help people be more resilient. So that might be practical resilience interventions, so thinking about how we build homes on stilts, or even it's possible now to build homes that can lift up when floodwater is coming. But it's also, in the case of the coastal context, accepting that some places will have to transition. There are communities now that are not going to be able to stay in place in the face of increasing coastal erosion risk. We're seeing that on the ground. That's happening today. It's not a future strategy. I have colleagues who were working in the Coastal Transition Accelerator programme in both the East Riding of Yorkshire and North Norfolk, and also in the South West, who are out having conversations with people about the fact that their houses are no longer sustainable, that they will have to withdraw. And that happens on our local government colleagues are doing that on a daily basis in some parts of the country. It's not in a future we don't know about. It's a future that's happening now, and we have quite good data demonstrating what that's going to be like, but we need to understand better how we can support our communities in terms of education and awareness and their own personal flood resilience at community level.
And that's an interesting question, because I met with the Environment Agency fairly recently with regard to to a street in Chesterfield that's been flooded. As I said, tragically, one person lost a life, but it floods extremely quickly when it starts flooding because of the geography of it. And the Environment Agency said to me that they could buy the houses of those people more cheaply than they could protect them. And so therefore, there was an economic case, not for attempting to protect them, but from effectively a compulsory purchase order. And the people on the street were reasonably enthusiastic on the whole on that. But when we actually said, OK, great, well, let's talk about this, it was clear there was no kind of planning government, there was no funding government that would actually allow this practical step to happen. So whilst I understand exactly what you're saying about, there are communities that are going to constantly flood, do you have any sense that government have a plan to actually move to that next stage and think about how we work with communities to move to alternative areas?
So schemes like the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme, that has a Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme, which is exploring some of those issues in detail in the context of coastal communities. So there is innovation work going on there. There's work within the Resilient Coastal Communities and Seas Programme as well, funded by DEFRA and the UKRI, that are looking at those questions, looking at what can happen, because of course in a coastal context there's no insurance for coastal erosion. So people who are losing their houses to coastal erosion have to pay their own costs generally, or the vast majority of their costs. They can even be fined when the debris from their house ends up on the beach. So they are doubly burdened with those costs. And people don't always want to go. Their lives are there. Their family may have been there for generations. So no, to answer the question bluntly, I don't think we or government know the answers yet, but there is work going on in that space to try and work out in innovative ways how that can happen.
Thanks very much. I'm going to bring in my colleague Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, Professor Naylor, I think many of us will have been struck by what you said about seeing into the future. And earlier today, my colleague Anna Geldert and I had a briefing from the Marine Environmental Data and Information Network, MEDIAN, and they were talking about precisely what you said about the importance of data, and in particular the role that AI was now enabling them to have to turbocharge that data and see into the future. What do you see as the role of AI here in what you're doing, particularly with morphology and so on?
I can answer that, and then I'll draw it back, if that's all right. I actually have a very talented PhD student, and a podcast was just released yesterday by the Scottish Government, a whole series funded by the Scottish Government on climate. But she's working with AI, and it greatly accelerates the rate at which we can use these data sets. And we've done a lot of innovation in the Scotland's Dynamic Coast project around erosion, where you can actually use satellites to find the vegetation edge, and the vegetation edge is perhaps a stronger metric than mean high water springs and wet dry lines. It's more reliable, and we've developed this new methodology that's publicly available, source code, and they actively use AI to help write the code and do things. So it's a huge area of innovation. It's one of the things that can be done well with AI. But moving back to the kind of communities and the kind of data is that, people often, I've had, people from Scottish Government, people from governments elsewhere in the world say, we can't act on this data, it's too uncertain. And I think what we don't want to do is get fixated on, we have enough evidence to do the community planning, to take the bold decision, to set up a really strong process, deliberative, consensual finance process to really take those accelerators, because there was the previous pathfinders as well, and make those much more normal rather than exceptions. And I actually think there's a role for the insurance industry as well.
Can we bring Dr. Sayers in on that? I think he indicated.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, just I think machine learning in particular, if you like, the methods that underlie the AI, definitely will see huge advances in understanding what's there on the ground, what infrastructure exists, etc. But on that broader point of looking into the future, I think it's important to say that there are really quite tough, legitimate choices to make. Regardless of how well we know the future, there will be hard choices to make. So we've been working on the FENS, a regional climate change risk assessment. And there's real hard choices there about whether you do try and hold the line, which would be possible but expensive, or maybe you advance the line where the defences are, or whether you set back some of the elements and recreate salt marsh and wetlands, as well as protecting some agricultural lands. So we're good at incremental adaptation, I would say. Our processes are built for modifying what we've been doing, adapting to a new climate in an incremental way. But we're really not that good when it comes to that transformational choice, because they are really quite hard choices, not just the funding, but how best to do it. And that's where I would say we're not that well set out. There's only a few studies that really explore that range of futures and have to get multiple organisations involved to, once you've decided that, to buy into it. Just on a related point, most of the choices we make today have very long lives. If you choose to build a defence, or if you choose to build a town, that is there almost forever. You've locked in that choice and we're not really very good at taking that long-term view when there's a transformational change required rather than just incremental adaptations.
If I might just very briefly come in on some specific instances of AI. So one is in relation to weather and flood forecasting. A next very interesting one is around the use of generative AI to generate solutions. So how can we come up with sets of interventions which are matched to particular places? That's a very human exercise at the moment, and we can foresee some of that being done by machines, including the visualizations, which help us to communicate to people what the options are. And thirdly, what we refer to as optimization problems. So how do we rank solutions based on what our goals are, what are our objectives, and so how can we come up with much better priority lists? And AI will help us with that as well.
Thank you very much. Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm just going to go quite quickly because I'm afraid I've got some other business I need to shoot off to quite quickly. My questions are in the first instance to Professor Hall and to Dr. Sayers. There's been quite some public debate over the role that dredging can play in reducing the impacts of flooding. And it's certainly an issue that farmers in my constituency of North East Hertfordshire have raised with me. Would you like to comment on the advantages and disadvantages of dredging to reduce flooding impacts, and whether you believe that dredging has been under or overutilised as a flooding resilience measure?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the advantages, what dredging does is increases channel capacities, so it means that more water can flow downstream towards the sea. And in very flat areas, like in the Somerset levels, it actually just provides a storage volume, a storage space for the water to go into. So that's why people have done it for many years, many hundreds of years in some instances. What are the disadvantages? The first is the cost of it. This is something you need to keep on maintaining. You're doing something with sediments, with mud, which nature doesn't want you to do. So nature brings the sediments back into the place, and so you have to keep on doing it forever. It obviously has environmental impacts for aquatic biodiversity, and I suppose more fundamentally, this is an artificial version of the river and the floodplain, and there are instances where actually one thing is you're separating the river from the floodplain, so you're not actually using that active floodplain to manage flood risk in the way that it would to some extent be done in nature. And actually there are instances where people have stopped dredging and reconnected the floodplain and have managed to get the water levels down. Obviously, there's big implications of that for the people who are farming on those floodplains. So I'm afraid I'm not going to answer the question, should we be doing more or less, because I think the answer is it depends.
Okay. I don't know whether Dr. Sayers wants to feed into that before I move on to my next question.
Only to add very briefly, it's definitely in the depends category, but your system of thinking used to be trying to convey flows as quickly as you can, and Jim's outlined whether dredging does that or not. But there are places where it causes a blockage. So sometimes drainage sediments cause a blockage to a bridge or a culvert, or which that is a legitimate part where you can think about conveying it more quickly to release that blockage. The river channel, more general river channel dredging, I would say with Jim it's context specific.
Okay, so well, to follow up on that point then, are there specific locations where you would suggest across the country where dredging is a particularly relevant technique for continuing to manage flooding risk? And how do you think that relates to the specific flooding risks that are arising as a result of climate change?
Yeah, so, I mean, actually, Paul just referred to one very interesting specific location. So places where bridges, culverts are prone to blockage, then that maintenance dredging is a good thing to do in that context. I mean, we know the locations where the current agriculture, to a greater or lesser extent, depends on dredging. It depends on very engineered land drainage. And so the big kind of political and sustainability question is really, do we want those economic agricultural activities to continue going on in those places, or are we ready to consider adapting them in the future? And there's, from a technical and scientific point of view, we can explore the implications of that, but ultimately this is a political decision.
Dr. Sayers?
Only along the same lines, but slightly nuanced perhaps. Generally, dredging only creates storage. It doesn't actually convey much more water quite often because it slows the flow, depending on where you are, and just creates storage. So you can dredge, and you can put a lot of money into dredging and have no impact on flooding at all. So you definitely need. It shouldn't be the go-to version. You need to understand it's not just a historical practice, but there's not other ways that perhaps you could manage the sediment entering the river, or reconnect the floodplain depending on the time of year it floods and whether you can have that. So I would very much say that should not be the first draw. You've got to understand exactly what's happening to the system before you embark on the dredging process, because it does have a lot of more negative components in terms of biodiversity and in terms of an ongoing cost that perhaps you don't need.
Okay, thank you. And so Dr. Sayers, then, off the back of that comment, are there particular techniques that you would encourage to be used either in collaboration or as an alternative where it's not the right option? Are that, where we're seeing dredging at the moment that could be used instead?
Yeah, so everywhere's location specific, so everywhere needs thought in that context. But if you are able to modify the farming practice to reduce sediment yields into the watercourse, that might help. If you're able to remove those blockages, particularly, that often helps. So that speeds the flow and keeps the river in regime a little bit more, as it's called, keeps the sediments moving through the system. But it's definitely a case of thinking about that place before you just continue what you were doing previously as a dredging action, because that's what's happened. You've got to think, well, okay, is this actually reducing the flood risk? But it's unfortunately context specific. So it's difficult to answer in the general.
Thank you. Then a final question then to both of you. The Environment Agency has come into a fair bit of criticism for some of their approach to dredging from people who would like to see more of it. Do you have any recommendations that you would like to see us consider in our report for how the Environment Agency deals with the prohibition or encouragement of dredging?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to set out the pros and cons as best I can, and from what I've seen of the debate on dredging in the media, in political spaces, I don't think it's been very useful. And as you say, the Environment Agency has come in for a lot of criticism. I'm not sure whether the Environment Agency has had an opportunity to respond to that. I would like to see a kind of much clearer, more open debate around the pros and cons. And as I've said, there are scientific aspects of that, which I think it would be great if people understood a lot more. But also there are values aspects of it in terms of what we want and how we trade off those different things we want. And I'd like to see more discussion of that.
Dr. Sayers, final opportunity.
On the same line, that there's well-targeted interventions which include dredging in some places. As we've said, some of those places, there's no reason why just a general reaction, you shouldn't dredge, or you should dredge. It's definitely a case-by-case discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John Whitney.
Thank you. Question, first of all, to Dr. Sayers. How comprehensive and how joined up is England's monitoring of flood risk and water levels, especially in those areas most susceptible to flooding?
So I think we have, if I may, I'll just slightly modify your question and see if it's the same question. In terms of monitoring water levels, so actual in-river water levels, say, or tidal levels at the coast, or rain gauges, there is a very well-established system. There are some gaps in the network, but it's a very well-established system. How well we monitor flood risk is quite a different question of how we understand where has flooded, what were the impacts, what are the condition of our assets, and those aspects. That's quite a different question. But in terms of the basic hydraulics and hydrology, we have quite a well-established network that requires continued improvement and continued investment in. But I would say that element is quite well resolved. In terms of understanding and monitoring real asset condition and where floods have actually happened and to what depth, is much less involved. So for example, many years ago, in fact, I was involved in a pervasive monitoring campaign that would think about instrumenting large elements of the city for when floods happened, when storm overflows occurred, or surcharged drains, and thinking about where the floodwaters actually went, rather than just the river levels.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add in? From the coastal perspective, flooding resilience is about people and assets in particular places. We monitor the water rather than where the landscape wants to respond. So it's more easy to understand at the coast. So barriers like Slapton, Lubar and Devon, and actually in front of the Penzance railway line, it used to be on stilts. It used to be wet by the sea. We're not planning for that kind of landscape change. And one of the things we did in Scotland with the Dynamic Coast Programme is we actually looked at erosion-enhanced flooding. So where you lose a sand dune, or it breaches in a storm event, which you had at Cley in the 2013 storm surge, for example, that flood envelope is much, much wider. The same thing happens to rivers. Rivers will burst their banks. I was looking, there's lots of burst banks. It's because the river wants to change its course in response to this increased rainfall. A really good example, which falls in the constituency of this committee, is in Shrewsbury. It is an oxbow lake waiting to happen. The mainline railway, the A road, connecting the city, are right where the river wants to cut that oxbow lake. How much money are we going to continue to put in to shoring that up? Because it's working completely against nature. I know that's it's one of these big difficult ones that Jim Hall was talking about, but it's something I think we need to address. So we need to monitor to predict when rivers will change their shape and position, when we'll have these avulsions, and plan for those. So it's a changing the course of flooding, and somebody described that earlier in the first session. And so we can use monitoring and prediction for that, but also monitoring the social disadvantage. So we did the first social disadvantage to erosion in Scotland, but the social disadvantage changes. And also monitoring these resilience measures. What if all the metrics of index of multiple deprivation, all those statistics are the same, why is one community more resilient and adaptable than another? We need to understand that, and we're not monitoring that social side.
So McDonagh, have you got any more comments in terms of coastal communities for the question?
So coastal communities are where we need to try and fix things. They're vulnerable in all sorts of ways, and if we can do it in coastal communities, I have good hopes that we can do it elsewhere too. Now, the Met Office do a good job of predicting coastal storms, and coastal communities, especially estuarine towns, also get fluvial floods, but they get warning of that because they're down river. But we need more about compound flood events and cascading risks. But I think the biggest lacuna in all of this is, and it was signalled briefly in the first session, is about public compliance with flood warnings. We don't know very much about how people respond, how we can better help them to respond, how we can better understand the vulnerabilities of particular groups. Paul's work is doing some of that, and it's really important. And the support that's needed both in emergency situations for vulnerable groups and vulnerable places, that's schools and hospitals. Lots of those are in flood risk places, and we need to know far more about what happens in those situations. So we need support in emergency situations, but also about adaptation in the face of climate change. So what can we be doing now rather than waiting for it to happen? So we know communities of good often form in the aftermath of disaster, but how can we intervene now to better support a range of different kinds of community with a range of intersectional challenges, better prepare for that to happen?
A question for everyone, really. If you could prioritise any improvements to monitoring flood risk and water levels, what would they be and why?
Prioritise or privatise?
Prioritise.
Prioritise.
Sorry, quite
I was worried.
Yeah, I've never said that. Prioritise, yes.
One of my suggestions is we need to better understand how nature-based solutions work. So that's both large-scale river restoration and also urban-scale grey-green infrastructure, so sustainable drainage systems. We know they are good. We don't really at this stage know exactly how they function, what benefits they bring. We need much more monitoring, and we need to put the money in at the beginning of a scheme so the monitoring is in place right from the beginning, and often that doesn't happen. Money for capital goes in, it doesn't include money for monitoring. Monitoring is actually really fairly cheap in terms of the kit that needs to go in there. It's not a big additional cost. So more of that, more follow-up, so where we have large-scale coastal realignments, where we see managed realignment and breaches, we need longer-term monitoring after that's happened in order to know how it works and why, and be able to make recommendations. We've had pilot after pilot after pilot in the UK. We need to do a better job of monitoring and evaluation and sharing and networking that data. But I know my colleagues will pick up on other suggestions as well.
Yeah, if I might just briefly follow up on that very good point about monitoring nature-based solutions, because we don't have enough evidence about the effectiveness of them, and in some instances I think we're raising expectations about their benefits when the science is not fully settled. And that implies not just monitoring from the start of when they go in, but actually monitoring beforehand. We need the baseline. We can't turn back the clock, so it may not be possible to get a good baseline with a decent number of floods in it, but then can we find match catchments, so similar looking places which we can monitor at the same time, so we can compare the with and without nature-based solutions.
Yeah.
And just bring Dr. Sayers in on that, because I think he was indicating a moment ago.
Yes, thank you. I'm minded to say that all flood hazards, the flood itself, are modified by a whole range of assets. And I would say they are anything that modifies a flood hazard is a legitimate flood resilient asset or a flood asset. So that is definitely nature-based approaches. It's definitely embankments. It's everything you can think of that modifies the way that flood waters behave. But we're not really very good at monitoring many of those aspects. We focus primarily on agency-owned built assets, but understanding all of those assets as legitimate assets to be managed would drive a very strong monitoring case for those. In terms of the nature-based contribution, we did some work under a project called Open CLIM that used the current understanding of science, and as Jim says, there's gaps in that. But that suggested that nature-based approaches could contribute about a 10 or 20% reduction in expected annual damages across the UK. So a significant contribution if you really maxed out those nature-based approaches. And of course, they also provide a whole range of other benefits. But my big point was all of those assets, nature and built, are all legitimate assets to be monitored and managed from that perspective of the flood resilience, which we don't quite yet do. Split off third-party assets are more difficult, etc. But we need to get that whole system picture of what the asset system is.
Thank you.
A very couple of small things to add. One is that there's international guidelines on natural and nature-based features for flooding and erosion at the coast and in rivers. They're an excellent resource around some of this. And yes, we absolutely need more monitoring. But we also need, I think, there needs to be training. And there's a real opportunity for green jobs and apprenticeships. So one of the things that it's in a green-grey report that I led on in Essex. It was pioneered where they changed the mowing regime for pollinators. We've done work where we changed the type of rock material and the position of it to optimize it for marine biodiversity, for marine protected, to provide food for marine protected birds. For example, that was retraining the contractor. And in terms of engineers, the engineers that I've worked with, and Colin Thorne, who's quite an eminent academic in this space, talks about we need to change how we monitor, how we inspect, and can we bring in things, for example, in the harder assets from the historic conservation, where we do minimally destructive testings of buildings like the one across the road. Can we be innovative? But we need to then empower people and maybe look and refresh some of our criteria for defects and defects tolerances on the engineering design and work with the Institute of Civil Engineers so that we can afford things like green-grey processes to come in, because do we still need that defects tolerance? I remember talking to William Alsop, who's, is a really eminent engineer in coastal structures, and he said, we have a British standard, but do we need the British standard to apply to the icing on the cake? Or can we let the icing on the cake, be modified by organisms, which then keeps it wetter, which then reduces salt damage, and then attracts species, which then bioprotect? We need to really rethink and transform things, and that's about the people and about their approach as much as it's about actually what we monitor.
A bit more, yeah. So, Dr. Sayers, what role should short and long-term weather forecasting play in flood resilience, and how effective has it been in preparing for flooding incidents?
Just to check, you mean weather forecasting, not climate projections. So short in terms
weather
of
forecasting.
Yeah, the forecasting component. Yeah, I think they can play a much more nuanced part in my view, in that forecasting at the moment tends to forecast flood flows or large sea levels, large wave conditions. I think there's a misnomer, because I don't think they forecast floods. They tend not to focus on how all of those assets that we've been just talking about may or may not perform. So in terms of whether somebody living in a particular house is likely to flood, that isn't just a function of the weather. That's a function of how our asset systems behave during that weather event. So there are definitely elements to improve that, to extend it to be an actual flood forecast rather than a flow or a sea level or a wave overtopping forecast, which really helps people then understand whether they need to act and who needs to act. And by providing shorter and longer term versions of that, if there's more uncertainty, you can start taking more minor actions that might help. And then when uncertainty gets reduced, you can take more explicit actions. But that move away from weather forecasting to flood forecasting, actual places that may flood, taking into account those asset performance, which might take account of the antecedent conditions, so how long has it been raining, have the beaches been drawn down, is I think would be a real step change in how people are able to respond to that forecast, because it would be much more specific about the flood that you may face.
You mentioned the improvements. A question for everyone, really. So how can the weather forecasting and its use be improved to support flood resilience measures? Exactly how is it going to happen? To anyone? any member of the panel?
Thanks. Paul has set out a very kind of broad and I think correct end goal on the specifics of the weather forecasting. I mean, this is it is constantly improving, and we've referred already to what AI is now doing in weather forecasting, and so it is getting better, and the time scales over which we can reasonably forecast are being pushed outwards. There's still an issue, just to refer to one specific part of this, is to do with intense rainfall. We've talked about surface water flooding already. Surface water flooding is particularly challenging for forecasting because it's the consequence of a big downpour, usually a convective downpour in a specific place. And it could be very variable spatially, so you get it one place, you don't get it another. It's very, very intense, so it's quite difficult to forecast, and it happens quite quickly. Whereas if you're in a big river basin like the River Severn, it can take days for the full peak of the flood to materialise. So it's that short-term surface water flooding where there needs to be more work.
I think that there's been a shift in the type of weather we're getting worldwide. So I come from Vancouver, Canada, and there was a big hydrometeorological river, and we've got a weather bomb. Those sorts of things are much more challenging to predict because they're relatively new. And the one in British Columbia, we have some of the best geotechnical engineers, and every road, Vancouver was marooned. No grain could get out of Vancouver to China, and no goods from China could get into Canada. Every railway, every road was cut off from the damage from those landslides. So and then when we had the Hurricane Harvey down in Texas, it picked up the water. There was so much water on land, it picked it up and it created its own weather. So I think, there's an area, and I'm not an expert in this, I defer to the Met Office in terms of, do we have enough research in this? Do we have enough capability in these real extremes, like the Copenhagen cloudburst? And also, when do we need to act? How much more monitoring do we need? Copenhagen had two in short succession. The economic losses, the business disruption, the social disruption were so great that people agreed to spend 10% more on their water bills. And they have an amazing, incredible approach. And they're taking the city and looking at the geography, and they're making roads rivers, they're making retention basins, they're transforming their parks. It is phenomenal. We need that level of transformation to manage some of these challenges ahead.
Thank you, Chair.
Professor McDonagh, just on the issue around weather forecasting in coastal communities, are there particular challenges there? Any different aspects we need to consider?
Yeah, I think some of this I covered in an earlier answer. So I think there are particular challenges in terms of, many places in the UK experience multiple types of flooding. We need to get away from any notion that a place tends to be vulnerable to either the sea or rivers or flash flooding. Many places are experiencing them all at once. Our coastal communities obviously are also dealing with high tides and storm surges. On the weather forecasting, I think my colleagues have answered many of the questions about what needs to change. The one thing I'd flag is about communication, weather communication. So we need to think about how we convey what is often very technical information to our communities. Yeah. And the idea that people on the ground can respond to something that says a 1 in 100-year flood is going to happen is asking an awful lot in terms of science understanding of our communities. So, we need to think about are we communicating to people that this is likely to be the worst flood since so-and-so, so-and-so? How can we use histories of particular places to inform how we communicate, how we make sensible and intelligible information to our communities so they can make the best possible decisions? And before that even happens, we need flood preparedness actions. We need people to know what to do in an emergency. And that might be keeping a flood box upstairs so that they have the materials they need in the case of a flood. It might be having air brick covers. It might be having a range of other property resilience measures. And the ways of communicating that probably aren't, or certainly do not rely solely on, science communication. We need arts and humanities to help convey to people how we do those things. And projects through the UK Climate Resilience Programme that had a number of arts and humanities projects included Risky Cities, which was one that I was involved in, and that showed very clearly that drawing on histories of particular places, histories of living with water and flooding, allowed people to connect with and understand their risk in place, weather in place, and understand what needed to happen in the future much better than if we'd gone in there and said, hey, we're going to run a workshop about climate change, which I'm pretty certain we'd have had nobody in the room for. So we need to use this range of methods, which includes Met Office communications, some of which is excellent, but a range of other measures alongside that, and we need to be funding that as well.
Yeah. And Professor Hall, you said that broadly our weather forecasting is good, and that the science is improving all the time. It may be that public expectations are unrealistic. When it comes to the milkman, what I expect of him is to deliver my milk every day. When it comes to our weather forecasters, what I want is to know exactly what people seem to want, is to know exactly how much rain we're going to have and exactly what the impact of that is going to be. So, I mean, do you think that public expectations of the quality of information they're going to be able to rely on are possibly unrealistic? And can you be clear whether, in terms of the UK, is our weather forecasting broadly what we should expect in terms of where the science has got to right now, or is there something that we're doing less well than people in other nations?
So helping the public to understand the uncertainty, which is inevitable in a weather forecast. So it's never going to be precisely right, and particularly as you go out more days into the future. So how you get across that inevitable degree of uncertainty, and yet weather systems happen where one can be really very confident that something bad is going to happen. We've got it this week. The Met Office has already said that on Friday there's going to be a terribly strong storm hitting the west coast of Ireland. So this is quite a tricky communication exercise, isn't it? Saying some of the time we're uncertain, other time we are certain, and people have got to do something about that. That's the piece I think we've got to... we'll always be working on, to be honest.
Yeah. But basically in the UK, our science is broadly as good as science is.
And then in terms of the weather forecasting science, I would say basically yes. Worth recalling that the UK not only has the Met Office, but also based in Reading is the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, which is a really important European facility. And the thing really to keep an eye on, as I've said already, is the role of AI in this, and so we can see the science moving on pretty rapidly in the coming years.
And during Storm Babbitt, I remember famously that we were told we weren't as good at forecasting that because the weather came from the east. It normally comes from the west, and we don't know about the weather when it comes from the east. This sort of makes people lose confidence in kind of the quality of what we've got. But I mean, do you think basically public expectations may be unrealistic?
Yeah, I mean, there was more to it than that, let's say, in terms of the East and the West. So, yeah, I mean, we're a nation that talks about the weather a lot, so that's not going to change either.
Even this committee talking about it a lot. Right, Julia Buckley.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to start by thanking Dr. Sayer for your comments earlier about that context, the multiple factors around what causes flooding. So you talked about if the groundwater is already quite high because of previous rainfall, then that obviously plays into your risk of flood. And we heard from the previous panel about the fragmentation of different agencies, and what I'm hearing from you is how if we could join together those different alerts, weather alerts and factors and contexts, actually the residents would be much better informed about what that risk is. So if we've known for 2 weeks that the groundwater's pretty soggy, then we know when a storm comes that we're more likely to be flooded than if that hadn't been the case. So what helps us as a committee is any really very pithy, specific recommendations. Would you suggest that there is something there around joining together different sources of information that help us understand that risk from different factors?
I would, yeah, and I would couch that as impact-based. We heard it earlier, impact-based forecasting. So if you look at the impact of the weather forecast and how it all responds, and you look at that end goal of the impact, then that automatically brings together those different issues of antecedent conditions, that saturation, or like remember when Dawlish railway line collapsed, there was that series of events that brought down the beach. If you move to an impact-based forecast model, which that is a more global move towards impact-based forecasting, then that really makes you look at how the system is responding, and it may impact a person, a property, a piece of infrastructure. So it moves away from just that weather forecasting to thinking how it's responding.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Professor Naylor, did you have a comment?
Yes, I think it's important, particularly around storm events and how we signpost those, but also, you know, Paul mentioned these, you know, high magnitude, lower frequency events that are actually becoming more frequent, and that we need to be especially ready for those. I think the naming of storms has helped enormously, and I think there's a real positive, and people talk about them in their day-to-day, and that's really positive. But I think we need to look at what are the impacts of those extreme events, and how do we differentiate those lesser events from these extreme events, and so that the named storms don't become, you know, like something we just talk about rather than something we act on. But because the impacts of those extreme storms that's what we're not understanding well enough. How far inland is it going to go? And thinking back to monitoring at the coast, we don't monitor waves as well as we could. And wave run-up and wave overtopping, and that's coming in Scottish flood risk maps, because we typically think about the water as a bathtub rather than how far inland it's pushing. And you think about sea level rise, every centimetre is going to push the height of that storm surge even higher and farther inland, and predicting and forecasting and explaining that to people, that really needs to be much better.
That's really helpful for coastal, and then for inland river, like my constituency of Shrewsbury that you referred to. What about combining the fluvial and the pluvial? So combining that rainwater with what's happening already in the river. Is there a use in joining that together?
Absolutely, yeah, 100%.
Would you say that should be a key recommendation of this committee?
I think Paul Sayers mentioned earlier the multi-hazards, you know, so these multiple things. So and it isn't just the pluvial flooding, it's the fact that, again, I'm going to refer back to my part of Canada. Vancouver has historically been very rainy. Is, you know, how drains get cleaned here, and in Canada it's a civic responsibility, but also the street cleaners says you cannot park here on this side of the road, on this day of the week, so it's much more coordinating. So it's joining up the kind of maintenance as much as the rain.
Excellent. It's a perfect segue into the question I'm asked to ask you, which is looking at the grey infrastructure, so those grey assets. So you talked about my constituency in Shrewsbury. We're a historic river town, so we have Victorian infrastructure, which was not built for the volume of houses that we have. We're regularly flooded, both by that and also, of course, by storms like everybody else. So let's talk about grey infrastructure. And if I could start with yourself, Dr. Sayers, how effectively does England deploy grey flooding infrastructure, and how well maintained is it?
So above ground grey infrastructure, things like embankments and tidal barriers, I would say that we know it reasonably well for Environment Agency owned assets. We're much less knowledgeable about privately owned assets. And we're less knowledgeable about things like their condition and how well they might perform when loaded. So when a severe load comes on that grey infrastructure, how likely is it to continue to perform as you want it to, or may it fail? We're not really very sure about that. We have lots of assets that we don't really understand how they've been built or what's within them and how they perform. So there's definitely an element of unknown in that. And underground infrastructure, so all of those pipe, network, drainage infrastructure, we are really unsighted on, particularly where they are, just the basics of where they are, what size they are, and how they perform under intense rainfall loads. We're really unsighted on that at a national scale. At a local scale, we can establish it, but at a national scale, we're really unsighted on that. So that connection between above ground and below ground infrastructure is not that well known. Things like tow levels, of what the tow level of our coastal defences are, which is critical in terms of determining overtopping rates, is poorly known. So there is lots of gaps in our data knowledge. But there are really good moves towards that. The Environment Agency have made really good moves to try and marshal that information, but there are significant gaps.
Thank you, it's very helpful, and the same to yourself, Professor Hall.
Yeah, if I might just add on the flood defence grey assets, you may have seen the National Audit Office's report, which indicates that the number of assets in condition has reduced from 98% to 93.5%. So this whole thing about asset management is absolutely central to how we go forwards in the future. Getting the balance right between the revenue spend on maintenance and asset management versus the new capital spend on new stuff. And then on the underground assets, so the drainage assets, this is where we're in one of these situations where there's many different organisations with responsibility for that. So the water companies are responsible for draining houses. Then you've got local authorities, highways authorities, who do the drains that drain the roads. The Environment Agency has a hand in some of this as well. So the National Infrastructure Commission, 3 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken, published its report on surface water flooding and really pointed to this split responsibilities, which means that we're not being kind of purposeful enough in addressing surface water flooding issues.
What do you think we should do? How could we enforce these private owners?
So what the NIC recommended, to start with, is to stop making matters worse. And if we're talking about surface water flooding, this is around paving over urban areas which used to be permeable, and Schedule 3 of the 2010 Flood and Water Management Act. If you're going to make a recommendation on this committee, please recommend that Schedule 3 is implemented in the way in which the government has said it would do.
Three nodding heads. Do we have a unanimous panel on recommending Schedule 3? Thank you.
Good. So then where we went next was looking at as many opportunities as possible for sustainable drainage, so dealing with water on the surface, ponds, swales, permeable areas, and then coming through with joint plans, so bringing all of these organisations together to come up with strategic plans for how they're going to manage flood risk down to a manageable level, and that will involve some investment.
Sorry to rush you, we're just running out of time. Do you mean a shared strategic plan, or that they align their separate ones?
So, yes, a shared strategic plan. Where the funding comes from, the Commission recognised that some of this money will come from the water companies. It recommended that the Environment Agency part of the money should be devolved to the relevant local authorities so they can add it. For now, they're applying for lots of different schemes, whereas if they had a more settled, devolved budget, they'd be able to work in a more strategic way with the water companies to address surface water flooding issues.
Excellent. I am sorry to rush, but we are running out of time. Could I ask you, Professor McDonagh, do you feel that grey flooding infrastructure is used effectively and maintained specifically in coastal areas?
I think we've covered quite a lot of that in this session and the previous session. We've talked about progress being made, but there being a shortfall in maintenance funding and delays due to inflation, Brexit, lack of partnership funding, all of which is well documented in the report that Jim just mentioned, as is the end-of-life context of some coastal sea defences. And I think the recommendation from me is about thinking strategically about where we can use nature-based solutions to augment that, and that might be as an alternative to grey infrastructure, but there's also lots of green-grey infrastructure, so thinking about the kinds of projects Larissa's already mentioned, about how we can drill holes in groins to allow mussels to colonise, how we can green sea banks, and suds, of course, also grey-green infrastructure. And that needs to happen alongside education and engagement.
Excellent. We will come on to both suds and green in just a second. We'll come back to yourself, Professor Hall, and you've sort of answered it with your Schedule 3 plea, but is there anything else you'd like to say about whether grey flooding resilience is fully integrated into the planning system in terms of new builds and the infrastructure that supports them?
No, I don't think I have anything more to say on that.
Yourself, Dr. Sayer, anything further about new builds and the grey infrastructure, whether it's suitable?
No, I think Jim's covered it.
Excellent. We're catching it with ourselves. Yes.
I just wanted to make the point about things that we might get a unanimous decision around the panel on, is that the Coastal Protection Act of 1949 has not been updated, and it separates the responsibility for coastal erosion from coastal flooding. So the local authorities have to manage coastal erosion. That creates major challenges for grey infrastructure assets. And I remember with Bill Parker being in Southwold, and he literally was walking along the beach, and he said, that's Environment Agency, that's a local authority, that's the Environment Agency, that's a local authority. And so changing that piece of legislation and rearranging that so that they're combined, because erosion and flooding, you can't separate them at the coast, you can't also separate them in rivers, but at the coast there's an artificial divide from very long standing.
Very helpful. We have a final question, but we're going to write to you to ask whether you have any examples from other countries that we could learn from in terms of the grey infrastructure. So thank you for your responses.
Thank you very much. Sorry, can we have Anna Gelder, please?
Thank you, Chair. I represent a coastal community in southeast Cornwall, and it's been really wonderful to hear lots of recommendations around nature-based solutions. I think there's a lot of work to do there about talking to communities about what we mean by nature-based solutions, and I'd really welcome you writing to us with further examples if you would care to do so. To Professor Naylor, are planning policy or resourcing changes required in order to enhance or repurpose land for flood resilience?
Absolutely. And I think you can start with making shoreline management plans statutory. You need to strengthen and streamline governance arrangements. So in Cornwall in the 2013-14 storms, we need elected members, we need the Prime Minister to be on message with local decisions. That didn't happen with David Cameron in the 2013-14 storms. A road was rebuilt in the same place where it already agreed it would realign. But what we need is the governance system to have agreed where that road is going, to have had those conversations, to have bought that land, and to have planned for that land so that when the storm hits, we can move it. And it might cause more disruption in the short term, but we're not wasting money. And Cornwall County Council paid for that. We need many more powers to be looked at. So we created a Windows of Opportunity framework because a lot of land-based policies are not salty and they're also not wet. And this happened in Suffolk and Norfolk, where a farmer had lost half their land since the 1930s. They wanted to build holiday cottages. They built them. They can literally demount them. All the services are above ground. You can move them back as the cliff rotates. But it was the area of outstanding natural beauty policy that was a blockage. It was a closed window. So we have to really look root and branch across every land-based policy to help align it. And it's really this social land-based challenge of responding to the hazard. And so I think an overarching framework legislation, such as like a resilient future generations bill, and I could see one was discussed, was tabled in 2022. Can this Parliament bring that forward and kind of include this? Redressing the Coastal Protection Act as well would be really important.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Sayers, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thanks. This is a very key question. I think in flooding, responses rarely stand on their own. It's the planning system that is key, how we plan the whole system, which could be the catchment, the coastal cell, the shoreline management area. So that planning has to be much stronger, not reactive to developments, but a much more proactive process of planning our response, which flooding is part of that. So where are we going to maintain our functional floodplains? What are those functional floodplains within the catchment that really impact downstream flood levels, reduce downstream flood levels? So where are those? And identify them in the planning process to keep those in place. And where are the salt marshes that provide our protection to our coastal defences that we keep in place? Where might we develop? We were also looking at places where agricultural yields might be changing in the future. So perhaps we can use different parts of the landscape for flood management, because those are changing, where it links with biodiversity. So I think planning has to be much more proactive in trying to set out the vision for the catchment, for the coast, that obviously reflects the shoreline management plans and other flood plans, but it's planning that has to bring those into alignment. Quite often flooding doesn't have that ability, flood issues don't have that ability to align all of those issues. It's that planning process. I would also, that's the strategic, just one more on the tactical. I quite often hear that it's from local authorities, it's very hard to just get small schemes through, a few tens of thousands schemes that might make a real difference locally to get through, because the business case required is of the same scale as major investments. So I think something along the lines of having streamlined tactical investments for planning and building regulations.
Thank you. That's really helpful, especially to hear that joined up thinking goes in lots of different directions, including from the Prime Minister and Cornwall. I would very much agree and align myself with that comment. A further question to the whole of the panel: to what extent do grey and green flood resilient assets complement each other, and how could we improve this? I don't know who would like to go first, perhaps Professor Hall.
Yeah, in many instances we're seeing grey and green being combined together, and in some senses distinguishing between them it isn't all that constructive. So, for example, if we look at the Pickering scheme in North Yorkshire, very celebrated as an nature-based solution scheme, but actually a lot of the heavy lifting there in terms of flood protection is done by an embankment upstream of the town, which creates a big storage area. Now, it's very nicely landscaped, so you probably wouldn't even notice it if you went there, But that's the thing which, during the big floods, catches all of the water. Some of it's been attenuated up in the catchment, but some of it's been done by what I suppose would be classified as being a bit of grey infrastructure, though it doesn't look like it because it's literally green. And that's the way we need to think about these very integrated solutions in catchments, in towns and cities, in terms of integrating SUDs into urban areas and on the coast.
Any specific
I was similarly going to go on Pickering. I'm half wondering if so the one thing I would say is that we get lots of grey and green infrastructure, increasingly so. It's a really good thing. But just being aware that grey interventions in one place can contribute to loss of green interventions in another, perhaps especially in a coastal context. So, of course, a seawall in one place is going to limit sediment flow in an east coast, primarily southwards, and that then affects nature-based solutions we put in place. So just always looking at taking us back to always thinking in that whole systems approach. So place-based, hugely important in understanding context-specific, but that always needs to be within that wider context and thinking about how what we do in one place is going to impact what happens in another.
Thank you. Professor Naylor.
I can follow up in writing, but I just make the point that it's about the nature itself, and it naturally dynamically adjusts. So we need to make provision in coastal change management areas for the sand dune to roll landwards, to continue to afford the protection it's already provided. It isn't just about reconnecting or nature-based solutions which are based on nature. It's about how can we bolster nature. And in Scotland, 14.5 billion of assets are protected by nature. Only 5 billion by hard infrastructure, as an example. So I think we need to really look at that, and I propose actually setting river change management areas for where the river wants to move physically. But all the other comments I can just will substantiate and I'll provide in writing.
Thank you.
Very much. Pippa Halings.
Yes, so I'd like to pick up both that last comment and the comment about planning and this systems approach. But the planning system is through local plans, and there might even be wider areas. And even if we're going to the combined authorities, the strategic unitary authorities, there'll be wider sort of regional, but there's nothing national except for the land use framework. And as I understand, the government is working right now on the land use framework, which is about, across the country, what are all of the existing and competing values and uses of land. As I understand, the government is working on it. It will be coming forwards. The question would be, do you think this is the critical and perhaps only strategic level framework that we can look at that could say, how there does we allow the space for nature to adapt itself, for those sand dunes to come in, to give the land away, or to allow those rivers, or to allow nature to play this role to protect our assets? Is the land use framework, in your view, something that's critical to this? And if it's published before we include this, are we missing a chance?
If I might come in on that, this government has a number of things on the go in relation to spatial planning. I mean, there's work around housing, there's work which we're doing on the National Infrastructure Commission in terms of advising on a national infrastructure spatial framework. I would say, however, that having that national picture is important. But in particular for some of these big strategic questions, for example, around biodiversity or environmental net gain and nature recovery, so we can get how this all adds up to achieving our targets with respect to biodiversity, also carbon sequestration across the whole country. Similar thing could be said about housing. Does it add up across the whole country? However, if we're looking at flooding, I think there's a limit to how far you can go actually with a national map. And I would argue, as others on the panel have done, for a stronger approach to shoreline management planning on the scale of coastal cells, and a much stronger approach to catchment, analysing catchments and looking at the options across the whole river basin and working out how they can be added up to achieve a range of different goals.
I have a question follow on for that. Catchment planning at the moment has no material weight in planning terms.
Yeah, this country has a very weak approach to catchment planning, and it's not at all joined up. What happens in water resource management plans, local flood risk management plans, and so on, in relation to also to nutrients and sewage discharges, and so the quality of water is not joined up in the way it should be.
Can I ask the other panellists as well? Because we've got the land use framework, we've also got local nature recovery strategies, which are then sort of from the bottom up saying, again, without a material weight in planning, but they do look at, you know, how nature could play a role in terms of adaptation.
Yeah, I think that all of those things need to be strengthened and joined up, and also to look again for where these potential conflicts. How do we minimise conflicts? So how do we make sure there's enough open windows, that enough policies align with each other, that the process by which we can build resilience and adapt where we need to relocate communities and assets most smoothly. And that requires us to almost have some test cases. And one of the challenges with the adaptation pathways approach is it's linear and it pushes those decisions down the road. And we have to safeguard land now. So we talked about land banking earlier. And to do that, we have to understand what are we going to need that land for. So there's a really good example in Edinburgh where they're not rebuilding houses, not replacing light industry with houses. They're building a coastal park. That's excellent as a buffer. But then it's too expensive to move some of the utilities. But they haven't put an easement in that plan. We know that those utilities are probably going to have to move in 100 years. Are we building a climate resilient place for now, for 100 years, or for 200 years? If it's 100 years plus, then we need to be putting easements in to say, we know we're going to need to move these later.
And do you think that the land use framework is something which enables you to look at those conflicts and to start planning in a...
I would need to look in that particular framework. I'm more familiar with NFP4, so I'd be happy to follow up in writing, but I think there needs to be some overarching framework. And also that we reimagine things like new towns. So can we imagine climate resilient new towns? And so that the retreat becomes less negative and hopeful. And that, but that we're making sure that those are in those climate resilient places from landslides, from heat, from wildfire, as well as everything we've been talking about in relation to the water and erosion. Can you champion something like that? And how might that help bring the society, community along board? Likewise, in urban areas, we haven't talked about coastal salt marshes and things as green infrastructure. They've been separate from green infrastructure policy and thinking we need to see this much more as a continuum. So there's many places, but I think a strong framework that almost thinks, where's the water going to go first?
And Professor Syed?
So yeah, just a couple of points on that discussion. One, I would say we definitely need that honest debate, as we've said before, around those places at the coast that might be really difficult to protect. So that could be part of a land use identification process. So you understand that and you can start having a real honest debate about that. As part of a project that we've just started with the Tyndall Centre on open land, that is thinking about a national land use scenarios that identify places that conservation objectives might be higher, restoration objectives might be higher, agricultural yields might be changing, and where might be best from most effective from a green flood management response. But as Jim said, I don't think that is an actual plan. That's just some information, because depending on the climate future you're thinking about, depending on the socioeconomic pathways you're thinking about, those pictures change. But from an understanding of where are those trade-offs, where are the best places for conservation and agricultural yield and flood benefit, that's a really useful piece of information. But that catchment planning framework is really weak in the UK at the moment. It could be really much better through an aligned process. And just to draw an analogy to shoreline management plans, where there's coastal groups, where local authorities get together and think about that shoreline management planning process so they can talk with each other and come up with that shoreline management plan. You can think of the same from the catchment perspective. It doesn't have to be one large unitary authority, but it can be an aligned set of local authority groups, a catchment group.
So would a recommendation be here that there be strengthening of catchment planning, and in terms of that would be
and support for collaboration between areas, so coordination and collaboration.
You're not having one impact the other, which is what you've been talking about, particularly on the coastal area.
Exactly. So everybody having the opportunity to speak to each other, and that being funded in a realistic way that allows that to happen. And we have seen that in some places. There were really great exemplars, things like the Living with Water Partnership in Hull and the East Riding, which is the two local authorities, the Environment Agency, Yorkshire Water and the university, and that has a really excellent model, drawing on examples from the Netherlands, actually, which we've mentioned a number of times, as to how management can be achieved, and that happened at a catchment scale in that instance, but we need more of that. So it's probably not a single act that we can call on, but exactly that.
The strengthening of catchment partnership in general, and it's in terms of planning, but also between those different areas, whether they're coastal or the catchment that's needed around that. And another, just final, Chair, if you mind, as I'm hearing that social capital that you've been talking about, and a recommendation there would be that we're involving different departments, as well as organisations throughout the country in this, and therefore this needs to be part of our adaptation plan, which I think you're saying it's not necessarily, it's happening in small areas, but would that be a recommendation to this?
We can't talk about this purely in the context of DEFRA. There's a range of other departments that are actually crucial to this, because this is about people's lives and housing and employment.
Very best. I was working in Colombia when they had the massive flooding at the estuary there, and 4 years later on the communities were still living in refugee camps. When they took the research that they did on which families survived as family units after those 4 years, it was because of their social networks before that. They were the ones who hadn't completely fallen into illness and into crime to survive. These ones that had found jobs and had kept together was because of the things that you were mentioning, which is about that connection and connectivity to place before this happened.
And it takes us back to that idea of planning now for the future. How do we build these communities, these connections, this sense of cohesion now in the face of this, rather than waiting until too late until it happens?
Thank you.
If I might just underline the catchment planning perspective, and actually I would take that this is not just planning, it's catchment operation is where we're going, is to emphasise that this needs to be all of the functions of water, so not just flooding, which is what we're talking about today, but water resources, droughts and water quality. And it's an integral part of that will be the instruments we have for managing the land, so ELMS in particular.
Okay. Let me just bring Martin Rhodes in, and then if you'll get an opportunity to finish off.
Thank you, Chair. And in terms of time, I'll try and be quite quick in terms of the question, and then in terms of if you can keep your answers fairly short as well, just so I don't fall out with the Chair for dragging the meeting on any longer than need be.
I'm very patient.
First, in terms of around resources, a question about resources would be, do we have enough resources at the moment in terms of resilience measures? And if the answer is no, where are the pinch points, where are the problems in terms of funding, in terms of where would you prioritise? If there's one thing you would pick out that needs extra resources, what would it be? I'll put that to all of you. I'll start with Dr. Sayers.
So, do you mean resources into physical things or into organisational function?
I meant primarily financially, in terms of where if we're not putting enough money in at the moment, where would you say the priorities are for extra money?
Yeah, I think the priority for extra money is around that strategic planning element to get that well, two places. There are lots of quick wins that we know we could do, and there's been a report out on those, so improved maintenance of our existing infrastructure. So that's really where our flood risks are managed at the moment. So making sure those are properly funded, but also our ability to strategically plan, which we've been talking about. Those catchment-based groups will require some funding element to allow that alignment to happen, to allow good plans to come forward, because they're likely to be more cost-effective, more bang for the buck on providing those. So I would certainly focus on that strategic planning element to get that really well embedded, and to focus more on those maintenance actions.
Thank you. Professor Naylor?
I think in terms of the previous question, just very quickly to say that it's making space within the local authorities and the environment risk management authorities and all the other bodies to have time to talk to each other, to have the recovery teams come in and say, is this housing development sensible? You know, there's not enough time. We need to resource them better. But in terms of the resourcing challenges, I think adaptation, planning now. We can either plan ahead now so we can keep calm and engage in conversations, or we can just sleepwalk into the next disaster we know that's coming, and we'll have mental health problems, big economic problems, ecological crises, including the ticking time bomb of coastal landfills, historic ones that are falling into the sea. But I also think we need to be really fund innovation, and I really like that article or policy number, I'm not sure which, number is 168 in the, or one, I think it's 186, but the one about saying in coastal change management areas, we will have short-term development. We're not building bricks and mortar that's going to last forever. And we could really innovate. Can we design modular, flexible, agile communities? And can we figure out a way to have those communities be coherent? Can we look to the indigenous nations that have done that? And we're going to have to do that with wildfire elsewhere in the world. So could the UK be a leader in this? And there's an example of these are cropping up in a small scale, but can we make them bigger? Can we coalesce them similarly to what we've done with nature-based solutions? In Cleethorpes, they're trying to get and it's been rejected several times, of this building called Ebb and Flow, and it's using shipping containers. Now, not all of them could be shipping containers. It could be far more innovative, but that could deliver jobs, could deliver net zero, low carbon, but and also help seed the idea that not every community is fixed, and we're going to have to move them.
Thank you. Professor McDonagh?
Really brief answer. No, there's not enough money. Yes, we need more resourcing. For me, like Larissa, it's about centering adaptation. So really making sure this system we've been talking about all day as a flood resilience system, really making it as resilient as possible. I'm not sure it ever can be resilient, but we can build resilience into it, plan for adaptation, and really that is above and beyond infrastructure. That's really important, but it's about people and it's about how we support education, awareness, and use nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are brilliant on all sorts of levels we've outlined today, but they also build communities. Lots and lots of them are maintained by people who engage in planning them, who are out there weekend on weekend doing stuff that support them, and that kind of community building is going to be crucially important. So more of that.
Thank you. Professor Hall?
Yeah, I would say three things. So first, on the capital budget, the fact that this was settled for the time period 2021 to 2027 was a big achievement to get that kind of time frame. 5.2 billion commitment, now 5.6 billion according to the NAO. But that obviously 2027 is not very far off. That's roughly the level of budget the National Infrastructure Commission said was about right in terms of flood defence expenditure. But we recommend that is pushed forward to give a confidence of the roughly the same level of expenditure, but on a much longer time frame. Second, as we've heard, is maintenance, and so getting enough current budget into maintenance by all of those organisations with responsibility for maintenance. And the third is around capacity in local authorities, that the weakest link in a lot of this, be it planning or design or maintenance or emergency response and recovery and helping people to get back into their homes, is around capacity in the local authorities.
Thank you. And my next question is about moving on from the finances to the governance. One of the things that was mentioned in the discussion with the previous panel was the idea of bringing together agencies, in terms of the idea of having an agency that was dealing with the whole range of issues around flooding resilience, in terms of monitoring, forecasting, and so on, right the way through. What would you see as the advantages or the disadvantages of that approach? I'll go back the other way now, so Professor Hall to start.
Yeah, I must say, and this is a personal view, not the National Infrastructure Commission doesn't have a position on this. I don't see a great deal of merit in moving all the furniture around on a big machinery of government thing here. What I do think, and this would be quite a major reform, is this point around the catchment operator. So having a much more joined up view of all of the things going on in catchments, and having that done in a much more coordinated way.
We currently have a highly fragmented system. We've all flagged that today. We've also flagged some really good examples of collaboration and cooperation. But I think this is too wicked a problem, too big, too complex, too many departments, too many services for there ever to be an effective super body. And like Jim, I don't think we should be rearranging the deck chairs at this point in the situation. I think there is some merit in thinking about this regionally, and we have the beginnings of that through kind of regional flood forums and the like. But, you know, we would be talking about an organisation that needed to have housing, needed to have emergency response, needed to have schools, needed to have community groups, needed to have, you know, we need to build in third sector charity organisations into this, and I don't think that's a good use of resource at this.
Just, sorry, before I move on, just on that, so you would see more merit in the idea of greater coordination, maybe at a regional level, in terms of to coordinate the different bodies, rather than creating a super body, as you put it?
That would be my personal view, yes.
Professor Naylor?
Yeah, I think I would tally with them, and that would be my personal view as well. And I think you can look to things like in Glasgow, actually, you have the Metropolitan Strategic Drainage Partnership, and that deals with the water coming off, but not the water coming in, because it's not all about drainage. But that body is really important about bringing together, but it brings together the flood resilient, the risk management players, but we need to then bring in everybody that's on land that's affected players into that, and do that in some kind of coherent way. So I think that there is a space for creating, as I said earlier, more capacity with those people, so that there's more resource, because they need to work together and they need to have time. And that takes time to build trust, to build relationships, not just across those different bodies, but also with all the communities. And if you could have one voice, one contact for communities, that might make a lot of sense. But having people who have really good human geography skills and maybe mental health, you know, first aid skills, and they're doing that in Nova Scotia and Canada because of the flood maps coming out. So there's somebody they can phone and process the emotional effect of what these flood maps and erosion maps are going to do next week. And so I think we need to think, you know, be very careful about how we would structure that, but absolutely removing the deck chair is not a good idea. But strengthening policies to enable them and aligning them to identify blockages so we don't do maladaptive decisions is really crucial. So we need the governance piece alongside, like the legal piece alongside the governance piece, and recognize that, you know, to move the mainline railway in places, we're going to need multi-level, multi-sector, multi-scale decision-making across multiple, you know, local authorities. And could we have some exemplars? Could government fund some test cases of how we might do that in real places?
Thank you. Dr. Sayers?
I'm largely going to agree with what's been said. I think flooding influences too many things. There's too many things going on to think of a single organisation master planning that process, some super organisation. But I would highlight the role of the agency and strategic oversight is a really important role, and that could be very much strengthened, i.e. to be a much more strategic alignment process. So I think that alignment in that planning process and having real teeth and ability to think about that strategic alignment is really needed. An organisation with over total master planning responsibility is not needed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much indeed to Dr. Sayers and Professors Naylor, McDonagh and Hall for their evidence. Excellent and very long session. We weren't paying them by the hour, were we? No, we weren't paying them at all. But very grateful for you coming and for the evidence you heard. It's been tremendously helpful. Thank you very much. Order, order.